Hey, how's it going? This is Dylan with DylanPickups.com. Last night on our podcast on DylanTalksTone.com, we started talking about gain. So today I want to do a little bit of a video because it's easier to explain gain and what that means in a video. So first of all, a lot of times people get gain and volume mixed up, okay? And they're the same thing to a point, but they're not really. Anytime, when we're talking about an audio amplifier, gain typically means the difference between an input signal and an output signal, usually having to do with voltage, power, or impedance, okay? Gain meaning there's less when it came in than when it went out, okay? The relative difference between input and output is the gain, okay? Now, that does result a lot of times in volume, like amplitude, like louder. It gets louder when it goes up. And why is that? Well, I'm going to illustrate this with one of my fancy drawings right here. So, here's what we have. This is our input signal, okay? So this would basically be like our guitar, you know? Here's the audio signal coming out of the guitar, and it goes into the amplifier and it gets bigger, okay? That's the point of an amplifier. That's what we do, because we know that an electric guitar only puts out millivolts of signal, and we need more than that to hear it, okay? So this difference between this small signal and this big signal is the gain. Now, up to this point, the volume does get louder because the signal gets bigger, right? So we can hear it more. The interesting part about it though is every amplifier has a limit to how much it can effectively make a signal bigger before it, even though it tries to make it bigger, it can't make it any bigger, okay? In solid state amplifiers, a lot of times that's known as clipping, right? We hear it in guitar tube amplifiers as distortion or compression. Why do they call it that? Because when that signal gets bigger, it gets to its biggest potential, okay? So I'm using these two lines as the largest potential of signal possible, which means it's as loud as it's gonna get without messing anything up. When we turn it beyond that, it flattens the tops off and makes them a little bit squiggly. The amp still gets more, the voltages still change, the overall impedance of the circuit still changes. So the sound does change, but it doesn't get really any louder. It just kind of gets more messed up, okay? It clips the tops of those signals off. Even though that signal is trying to get big in there, it is kind of held to a certain size, and that's where we get the distortion that we love, okay? And typically, most of the time, we set our amplifiers to where it's just at the point where it's starting to do this, right? So that is kind of the tubes are working their best, everything's clipping along like it's supposed to, and as we just get into this range, not too much, we just get into this range is when a tube amplifier sounds its best. So, the difference between quote-unquote volume and quote-unquote gain is the volume stops going up when the amplifier has reached its maximum potential, okay? So that's why there's those goofy memes on the internet about the gain knob isn't a volume knob, right? Because the more we try to smash through here, it doesn't really get any louder. In fact, sometimes, depending on what the frequencies are doing, it can sound quieter because you're clipping off certain parts of those frequencies as you try to kind of smash it through this opening, if that makes sense. So the misnomer of turn up the gain to hear more is really, it's false, because you can almost, it gets to the point where you can almost hear less really, because it's not as clean, okay? So in our next video, we're going to discuss different ways of setting this chain up so that we can get different sounds from our guitar. Because there's something that's very, very important that a lot of people overlook. the relationship between the signal that we have not yet amplified and the signal that we have amplified and what comes out the other side has a lot to do with the potential of the amplifier, meaning the frequencies that it's really good at making louder. Also, the frequencies that we put into the amplifier in the first place. Okay, so how good the amp is can be affected by what we put into it, including how we play, because we can affect what happens over here with our hands before it even goes into the pickups. So all these things are kind of mixed together, or they're not mixed together, but they affect each other in a cascading effect as we go down the line. But we want to understand that volume, the louder the signal gets to a point, and then it becomes saturated, compressed, clipped off, distorted, depending on how you want to say it. And each of those terms means something a little bit different, because of the basic, nature of this conversation, just understanding this part of it, we'll just say it at that. So then our next video, we're going to discuss really how we can affect one to the other and really make some sound. This is Dylan with Dylan Pickups and DylanTalksTone.com. Please check us out. If you have any questions or anything you want to know in relation to this subject or anything to do with guitar tone, please let me know, and we will talk to you soon.